Good evening. It's July 4th, 2024, and we're in Kennewick, Washington, and en route toward Boise, Idaho on July 4th. Happy July 4th, everyone. And we're really happy to be back again. It's been a long period of time. We were traveling so much we didn't have time to sit down together and make a podcast. So I'm here tonight with Alicia Williams across from me, and Jeremy Lazelle, and we're in Kennewick, en route after stopping in Yakima, Washington today, and we saw Amazing Cemetery, and ready to jump into reviewing the last week, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, fantastic. How exciting. This is our sixth podcast, and people seem to be responding pretty well to it. We're getting a lot of comments, and we appreciate that. And yeah, John, we were in Superior, Arizona at Fairview Cemetery. Really interesting site. I believe it was a copper mine town before. Is that correct?
That's right. The town was built on copper mining industry.
Yeah, and small town, about 2,500 people currently, approximately, and moderate-sized group. But we were the mayor came by and and spoke and offered encouragement, and so it was actually an amazing event. It was really wonderful to be in the small town of Superior, and it hit over 100 degrees that day.
Oh my gosh, it was.
That's right. It was
so warm.
Very, very hot, and different from the heat and humidity that we were accustomed to in the southeast of the U.S. But what did that do to the stone? It's a little different than what a humidity will do to a stone, if I'm correct.
I mean, the monuments, gravestones and monuments there were in excellent condition overall, and the low humidity in the air and the arid, terrain lends itself to the preservation of stone. So it was a wonderful site to work at, and the group there was really interactive and involved, and it was really.
It was a great group, small group, but a really eclectic, interesting bunch.
Yes, very much so.
And the small population of the town, I found very interesting because the cemetery might be one of the most lovingly cared for and attended to sites that we've seen yet on the tour.
Absolutely. And so different than many of the other locations. And 2 days later, when we were in Altadena in Los Angeles area, was like diametrically opposed. And so in Superior, I love the small town kind of, the heritage, the history, the people visiting their ancestors' graves on an ongoing basis, and virtually no rules. I'm really that's more my style, and the fact that people could express themselves in the ways that they found, important to them, and they weren't encumbered by, a lot of bureaucracy.
Right, I agree.
Yeah, the two of you, when you did your first location scout at this particular cemetery, you were amazed by just the amount of creativity that was involved there. Do you recall some of the ones that stood out to you? What made it different from the traditional ones on the East Coast?
There was one in particular. There was a cast, I believe it was an angel.
Right.
That was kind of slightly deteriorating, rounded around the edges. And she stood out to me so much because so many times we walk through these sites and all of the sculpture is very somber. It's in a state of grief. It's in a state of mourning. But this little statue had a slight smile to her face, almost whimsical. And I really appreciated the creativity behind it because it was clearly something that was handmade and not from a solid piece of stone. Very unique and beautiful there.
Wasn't that something that Manny, the host, had said he had excavated, buried, or was that a different stone?
I don't remember exactly.
I believe it might have been. And but
I know it was really like covered over maybe with a bunch of the bushes or hedges or anything, but there was not a lot of sculptural art, if any, there, but that one was there. And
yes,
it being cast out of, material and molded into that shape, it really just stood out to me quite a bit.
absolutely. In the poorer areas, and there's a strong like Native American or Spanish Mexican influence. There's a lot of personal expression and a lot of like, flowers like silk flowers and a lot of cast materials and painted things. And it's very bright. But people were visiting those graves on an ongoing basis.
Right. I remember you were quite confused about the fact that like where's the historic section? And Manny's like, we don't have one because whatever was historic, the families continue to maintain and they continue to be buried with their families. And this is something that's so unique to what we see a lot on the East Coast, where the cemeteries have the historic section that, melds into the newer section where the more current burials take place. Not a lot of new burials are happening in the historic sites on the East Coast, you know?
Yeah. Well, it was fantastic. And a change of scenery for sure.
Definitely. I enjoyed the beauty of the surroundings.
And I want to just do a shout out to the host, Manny, who was fantastic, and his associates, and they have a group there, Rebuild Superior, that is a nonprofit that is active and involved in many, charitable endeavors and like the food bank and all kinds of different things. So the cemetery was just one of many, tentacles of a big spider web that they're really doing great work there. And so it's fantastic to see, people out there who care about their local community. That's one of the things that really struck me. And the mayor showing up as well just really connected the dots there, because she, showed her love for the history and for the community. And she herself had her ancestors buried there in the cemetery. And so that's the difference we see in these small towns. It's kind of like a different, older version of America when people had much more local and community involvement and much more like multi-generational kind of involvement in their, community. So it was fabulous to be there. It was a great event. And by the end of the day, I think it had 106 degrees. And but we went through and did that one more repair in kind of a little bit of shade, and we got everyone involved doing that, right?
Yeah, it was great. It was great. We even want to shout out to the 2 little tarantulas you dug up.
Oh yeah,
and happened to save and relocate.
That's
that
right.
Day.
That's right.
Hope they're doing well.
I've had black widows a bunch of times, and then tarantulas. No, that was awesome. And and there was not one but 2, and we brought them over to a more shaded, higher grass, and so they could relocate.
That's right. And ended up with a lovely repaired monument. That was actually a pretty intense repair, and it looked great.
No, that was an excellent event. So it was a lot of fun, and just really left there with a good feeling, and leaving the kind of knowledge behind. And they were excited to see how with simple principles and just leverage and a pry bar and some blocks and gravel, they could really make big improvements to that site. So that's really the joy to leave that behind with them.
Definitely.
Certainly. Yeah, they were very attentive and very appreciative as well, I'm sure. Next up, we made the trip to my hometown in Southern California, to Altadena, and that was Mountain View Cemetery. That was a pretty big crowd.
It was. That was a huge turnout.
That was nice to see.
Especially compared to the last few events before that, it was an especially large crowd. It was a great turnout.
Yeah, it was a great group of people, and it was really interesting site, and like the history there was actually phenomenal because the kind of town of Altadena was influenced and built around the cemetery in some degree. So to some degree, so that's really unusual. I think that there was actually, I believe, an ordinance that prohibited cemeteries, so they made a new town, or I don't remember the exact details, but it was a very unique history.
I did hear a couple of the people joking that the cemetery was the oldest business
Right.
in Altadena. So
Absolutely.
that was
I believe
pretty
like
interesting.
1892.
Family owned for like 5 or 6 generations, correct?
Sixth generation. The fifth generation is currently in charge, but the sixth generation is in the wings, learning and waiting to take over. So yeah, pretty amazing.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm looking online real quick just to refresh my memory. Yeah, the cemetery includes cemeteries formerly owned by the Masonic Lodge, the International Order of Oddfellows, and the Catholic Church, with burials dating back to the 1850s.
Right.
A lot of history there.
Right. They did discuss accumulating several of the surrounding properties as those went defunct and lost their management or administration. And, they do a really great job there. I think it was interesting that they pointed out a lot of the people buried in there, especially the more historic older graves, are buried as individuals in individual plots, not a lot of family plots going on there, because that region was by, I guess, people trying to find a new life, a new beginning,
Right. Well,
someone starting out.
Early days of California.
Yeah. So. It was very unique. We did see a few troubling things there with the way the flush markers were being dug out and instead of lifted up and leveled.
Well, settling, and that was just because of the ground building up or them settling over the course of time. But it was, interesting how we could observe similar phenomenons in different parts of the country that are common problems. But yeah, the opposite of there was new local involvement, and the primary host who reached out to us, Renee, was awesome, and he was incredibly enthusiastic, and I believe he just completed right after we were there was a separate ceremony to celebrate that he's cleaned 1,000 gravestones, which is awesome. And so they're definitely getting into the preservation there more, and there's potential for huge community involvement because there's so many stones that are in need of attention, that are sunken, and that don't have families involved anymore. And so that's the thing, is that most of the families are not involved, have moved on, or don't even know there's a gravestone. So there's a big place for friends groups and local, volunteers to, help fill that void.
Well, I think when you showed them how easy it was to lift up one of those flush markers and set it level with the ground, I think it was pretty inspiring to them that, maybe they're going to be able to have a good group of people go out there and start making those improvements along with the cleaning. They've done a really great job with all of that. There was hardly anything there to clean. They've done such a good job.
Well, that one stone that you pulled up with the tripod, it wasn't. I mean, it took a little bit longer than which most stones take, I think, because it was a bit longer than most. Am I correct in saying that?
Was that the veteran stone that was entangled in the tree
But it
roots?
brought a bunch of people out there to help dig.
Yeah.
And it got more involvement with everybody.
That was really,
Yeah, you had to dig pretty deep for that one.
Yeah, it was just way sunken in. The soil there is like such a alluvial kind of soil that things tend to settle, and there really wasn't a lot of foundations. And so they talked about moving water over wet periods of time also, and, transporting soils. But, we raised that way up. And under trees, there's always the roots, and you never know how well they connect, and, grab onto the stones and stop them.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
lifted.
I had an issue with the roots. There were roots just
That's
everywhere.
what it was all about.
Right,
if it wasn't
right.
for the roots, we could have just
Right.
pulled it up quickly. But the roots grab on. They're like a bunch of fingers holding on, and they're not letting go easily. So, yeah.
I guess that's what happens when you have these sites right next to these big trees like that. Over time, that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. We've
Right.
seen trees completely swallow a stone.
Wow. Well, next up, we went north to North San Juan, California, and that was North San Juan Protestant Cemetery up in the mountains of California, which was beautiful, big trees, interesting site, located on kind of a hillside up there in the mountains, correct?
Yeah, ghost town cemeteries, they call them. There's a whole bunch of them, or Gold Rush, and some of them are at ghost towns. So
Right. We took a kind of an interesting drive just to get there. It felt like we were driving up a backwoods fire road.
Yeah, we
up
were-
windy mountain roads just to get to this location.
Yeah, we had to go across some canyon to get
oh
there.
yeah, that was a beautiful drive and quite windy. Not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not.
Yeah, and at this particular site, a lot of history, really pretty stones. But I do remember there was one issue or a debate between you and the host about some historical bricks. I don't know if you want to dig into it
Yeah,
or
yeah.
not, but I think it would be interesting for the audience just to
No,
learn a
it
little
was-
bit more about what is considered historically significant from an archaeological perspective
Yeah.
and from a conservation perspective and restoration perspective.
I mean, I think there was a lot to lead up before we jump right into that, but it was a really interesting site, and the stone was generally in quite good condition. There was some really aggressive lichen that was attaching and living, in and on the granite that was literally digesting it, which was interesting. It was worse on the granite than the marble for the most part.
The marble was in great condition
Yeah,
there.
and because of the arid terrain there, the marble is just so well preserved. We'll never see something like that in most of the country. But yet on the granite, there was a different, problem.
Definitely.
And we see that lichen sometime attaching itself to granite and all over the country. And it was really taking hold. So anyway, then we did a repair first and reset. I'll just back up a little. That there've been a lot of previous interventions there, and it's a really interesting history because this Nevada City Cemetery restoration group, I forget the exact title of the group, but
they
it's
call
actual.
themselves Nevada Cemetery District for
Thank you.
Nevada County, Florida. Florida, California. That was
Florida.
terrible. No, it's on my mind. Anyway,
Yeah, so they have an interesting group that was founded way back in like World War II era to preserve the gold rush cemeteries because they're so unique and historically significant
most
to the
of
region.
them were already ghost towns then, and they were like, who's going to take care of them?
Right, so that's kind of the backstory, and they're the ones that invited us to be there, and I
Right.
didn't fully understand, and I will say also there was some initial confusion because when we saw Nevada City, we thought it was all going to be in Nevada City, and it wasn't actually in Nevada City at all because it was just that's county.
Right.
And so ultimately, the best location that was determined by the group who had reached out to us was going to be in North San Juan, which was, 20 minutes, a half hour from Nevada City. And we never actually made it to Nevada City.
It was a very interesting site.
It was.
The way they had designed the copings to keep things kind of level with the
Retaining
slope
walls.
on
Terracing, yes.
right, and no ground cover, which frustrated you a little.
Yeah, there's been interventions for maintenance that have affected the aesthetics of the site. And additionally,
Well,
they've
I
been...
think that it was also for fire prevention, to be fair, because they'd recently had fires nearby there. But that's part
Understood.
of it.
But with that said, there's been many previous repair efforts there, and many of the stones had Portland cement or other kinds of repairs or multiple repairs and were yet again leaning, and there was a lot of concrete underground, and so it's a really challenging site to work on with hillsides everywhere and all these previous repair efforts. And I don't know if everyone understands that working at a site where it's been previously worked on is really difficult in many situations because the hardest thing is to work around previous repairs and materials you can't remove. And so anyway, moving forward, we were working on this large marble gravestone tablet, which was actually never previously repaired. It was a more recent break. And honestly, it was one of the largest marble tablets, certainly the largest we've seen on the tour. And it was a good part of 6 feet tall. It was a beautifully carved marble in excellent condition, yet it was snapped off in the middle. It was not 2, but like 3 or so inches thick.
And by the way, we didn't quite know which stone you were going to work on, but Alicia was so excited when you picked that stone. That made her day.
Yes.
And I didn't quite realize why until I actually looked at it. It was a very large stone and beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, so I'm glad you did pick that one.
Well, the carving on it was phenomenal.
Right.
And we saw that early on, and we were trying to balance everything. And I always want to do more than we can. And also, we were working around actually an increasingly hot day on pretty big hillside. And so we decided to work pretty close to where we were kind of parked and where all our, gear was. And but the stone was phenomenal. And so in order to do the repair, which was a fracture repair, we needed to first level the lower portion of the stone, which was leaning forward and too high. We weren't able to just level it up. So in order to do that, we had to move it forward off its, existing footprint and then lower it down. And so that's when the event became a little more interesting and there was some dialogue and opinions expressed.
Yeah, there was a back and forth between you and the host of the event on just protocol regarding these bricks that were buried underneath that were initially there to help support, correct, and provide a foundation.
Yeah, well, to be clear, he was not the only. There was many people involved,
Sure.
And in fact, the people that had reached out to us were other people, and he was involved, and on the board, and he was definitely part of the group, and he was more on the history side, and he was a historian, and he had, written and was very knowledgeable on the subject matter, and the most knowledgeable one on the history of the region. However, he was in my opinion, overly concerned with the value of what the bricks were doing under the monument instead of focused on the monument itself. And that was the source of potential controversy.
So what is the protocol on something like that with bricks that nobody sees, that's buried, but you need to take them out to re-level and actually restore this monument? Could you just leave the bricks somewhere, or do you keep them safe and note that this is where they were located at one point? But that was the only way, right, to restore this monument.
I mean, yeah, basically, well put. They had to be removed in order to lower it and make the whole thing, level and safe to rebuild and, for it to last for the future. And that was the simplest technique. The way we moved it was not easy or, automatic. So we walked it forward and put it on some blocks kind of on a hillside in order to be able to dig it out and lower it down. So there's not one way to do things, but that was the simplest, fastest, and most practical solution to that problem. And so in so doing, after we moved it forward, we immediately were able to observe that there was basically a historic brick foundation appeared to have been laid under it, either initially or at some time after it was installed originally, and it had dramatically moved and heaved down the hill through soil creep and the movement of soil, downhill. And so in order to reset it, we needed to remove a couple courses of bricks, which is pretty customary for me. It was a pretty routine thing because brick foundations are fairly common. And in certain parts of the country, they're extremely common. In other regions, they're rare because they weren't in an area that had a lot of bricks. So yeah, I just basically jumped in and started to try to pop out some of the bricks, which then, could be repurposed. They could be used for another purpose. They are historic bricks, which means they're, older. There's not one, definition of that term because there was many eras when they made bricks in America, and anyway, that's when he was very concerned we were removing the original historic fabric and diminishing the site in a unnecessary or degrading way, I guess would be my interpretation.
Well, I'm glad actually that everybody had that discussion. That is important, and we certainly respect people's opinions. And when they care so much about the site, that totally makes sense. And I'm glad the two of you were able to have that discussion and work it out for the best situation for that cemetery.
I mean, we got the job done, and I'm not sure what the end result and the aftermath was from the local group. And so I will say also that we were training staff, and they have 3 full-time staff working in, I believe, 37 different gold rush cemeteries, as they call them. And this was only one of those 37, although one of the bigger ones, it was my understanding. And they were extremely interested, excited, and good learners to take in the knowledge that they were, really looking forward to using in future applications. So the event overall was an excellent event, and I don't want to overshadow the fact that also people did travel to that event from the general public, and there was a number of other people that traveled some distances, to attend and learn more and be part of the experience. So it wasn't. It wasn't just one thing for one person. It was, it meant a lot to many different people.
Yes.
Yeah, certainly. Well, again, a beautiful location. I think we were right underneath redwood trees, if I recall.
There were cedar trees.
Were the cedar trees?
Yes.
Ah, they were beautiful.
Yes.
Giant cedar trees.
I thought they were redwoods too, because they were enormous and they were, right into the stones in some areas. But they said they were cedars, and I'm not doubting their knowledge on that subject, but to me they seemed like redwoods because we don't have trees like that around us.
Well, I should know. I'm from California, but I guess I don't know. So
whatever they were big trees.
They were really big.
Yeah, it was stunning. I really enjoyed that location. Okay, and then after there, we traveled further north up to Canby, Oregon, at Rock Creek Cemetery, and again another big crowd and really well put together. I was very impressed with the host for this one. She worked very hard to make sure everybody knew where to go and was well prepared for the day.
Yeah, that was. Now we're moving into the next week, and which was
That was Monday. Yeah,
That was this past Monday. Gosh, that feels like a lifetime ago,
yeah.
doesn't it?
I mean, we were trying to get these podcasts out every week,
No,
but
but
it got a little hectic on the road.
Oh, it feels like that was a lifetime ago.
on the West Coast with the additional mileage that we're doing every
Absolutely.
day.
Yeah.
So we had 2 events in California, 2 events in Oregon, and 1 event in Washington, and so now we're up to Monday, which was the first event in Oregon. It was a good event, and it was definitely well attended, well promoted. One of the oldest sites in the region there as far as the history on that local church, which is no longer active currently. They're trying to raise funds to restore it, but it went back to pretty close to the mid-1800s, which for Oregon seems really old, and of course, in New England, it's not very old at all, but everything is relative. So, but yeah, it was a good day, and it was a really interested group, and we, learned a lot from doing the tour at the site, and then moved forward to a lot of people got involved in the cleaning, and it was very interactive.
Yeah, it was a big group, and I learned a little bit about a lot of the settlers from the Oregon Trail, and their families are buried there, and I can't imagine that journey just to get to Oregon. But they also mentioned that, unfortunately, it was a lot of the wives and mothers who were burying their husbands and children at that point when they finally made it to Oregon, and then they had to start new lives. But at that cemetery, yeah, there were a lot of settlers from the Oregon Trail, which I found interesting.
Yeah, interesting, the different histories in different parts of America, and that's all part of the 48 state tour. That, when we travel to different regions, we're like, jumping into their local history. And so for us, we're somewhere, 100, 200, 300 miles, distant in a day, or, and then it's just a different world apart to where we end up the next day. And so every locality, every location has such a different history, and that's, part of the whole kind of energy and, taking that all in and taking everything into consideration. So, but yeah, it's hard. The events all do start to blend together to some degree. And so I need to see the photo to see what I actually did that day. But
you did a lot. You were running around and you got in as much as you could.
I remember it got hot that day.
Yeah,
and,
it was perfect for the majority of the day. And then the clouds parted briefly in the afternoon.
We had, I think that was the first day we had the gentleman join us who traveled from Montana to learn about gravestone preservation. And so that was an interesting, adventure that he was on.
That was the day the lady ran into the ditch.
What's that?
That was the day the lady ran into the ditch.
Oh, that's how it closed. They closed out the event with elderly lady taking the turn a little too sharp, and apparently there's drainage ditches that are quite deep on the sides of the road for heavy rain or irrigation, and she ended up in the wrong side of that. And
but this is when she was exiting at a slow speed, so she was completely fine, right?
Yeah. The main thing is she didn't get injured in any way, but when we did leave the site, and I couldn't see this from the blind side while we were working and loading up the gear at the end, but that one of her wheels was actually in the air.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was,
kind of scary.
Hopefully it didn't do any damage to the car. She was definitely okay, although she was probably a little shook up first, and then I think mostly embarrassed.
Right, probably.
Yeah.
And,
I just want the audience to know, because the story started off like with some lady driving down the road and got into an accident. But again, for the audience, she was just exiting the cemetery and happened to go in a little bit of a ditch.
And it's my understanding she was very local, and everyone knew her well, and she had been there before and everything, and so she was just distracted, and maybe the sun was in her eyes.
No, she was just overwhelmed with the amazing day and all the education she learned. That driving just was something foreign to her at that point. She just wanted to clean gravestones.
Yeah, I think that ditch just jumped out in front of her, so it wasn't there before she turned. So,
well, and then after that, we drove further north to Warrenton, Oregon, and that's, you can pronounce the name better than I can. It's Class Top Plains Pioneer Cemetery. Try to say that 5 times fast.
I say everything wrong. I want to say Clatsop, but I don't, I'm not good at pronouncing things, and I don't do
well, y'all don't want me to say it. That's for sure.
Well, anyway, that was a collaboration, and I will just say originally there's a community college that was involved, in reaching out to me and the staff there, and I had connected with the head of the program at an event good part of a decade ago back in Iowa at the Historic Preservation Conference in Fort Dodge, Iowa, when I did a day-long gravestone preservation workshop, and we got to know each other and ended up visiting after and having a beer together. And ultimately, I never heard from him again until the 48 state tour connected us, and he reached out to us and said, yeah, we'd like to do an event with you. And so ultimately, that's what led to us, holding that event there, which it was an awesome event. According to the local historian there, who was awesome, and I'm so bad with names, I should remember everyone's name, but it's just a blur. But he was extremely knowledgeable and said that, it was the oldest existing cemetery, and to make it clear that there was other graveyards that had been built over and, removed according to the historical documentation. But this site was the oldest site that he knew of, and he had done a lot of research in the region, on the region, that this was the oldest site that existed still, so it was very significant, is very significant to the state of Oregon, and it was an awesome site to work at, and we were really happy to be there. It was a great event.
Yes, it was.
And there was staff there that was super interested from representing, I'm not sure, the municipality, the city. We were really well supported. They had gotten a huge amount of gravel and water, and they were on the job. I mean, they were there working with us. And, at the end of the event, they were really empowered by what they learned and wanting to move on and, clean and look toward fixing the remaining stones there because, we did a couple of one fallen obelisk and another marble headstone, pretty large, that was dangerously leaning, and then a marker next to it. And so we kind of reworked this whole little back corner of the cemetery.
You redid that whole back plot in the back corner of the cemetery, but you also re-leveled that little marker in the front where the tree stumps had fallen. You made such a significant impact there that day, and it was really cool to see this whole plot transform because you worked on these two monuments kind of simultaneously.
Right, we did
and
together.
Then there was this like third kind of was it a footstone that had been moved or something?
It was
next to it.
Slant. It was like a historic slant marker on a very large base.
Right, but they then just went ahead and took the initiative and redid that one too.
Absolutely.
So 100% that whole plot was cleaned up. And then someone else was like, oh, you have snips. I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut all the overgrowth around these other plots. There was no lack of worker involvement at all that day. It was great.
Yeah, the two guys that were like staff there, they were jumping in. And then the guy from Montana, I believe his name was Perry, he was on the job as well. And so there was a lot of digging and prying and leverage, and they really, got into it, and we got it done. I mean, so that whole area. And additionally, the cleaning, we cleaned a whole bunch of stones there. And so that site wasn't that huge, because a lot of the markers there might have been wood or are lost or maybe are buried underground. But from what's visible there on the site, we made a lasting and sizable impact in one day, which is really empowering.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful. And then after that, we headed even further north up to Roy, Washington at Roy Cemetery. And that was also another interesting place and a lot of participation, especially with the younger people.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. You can talk about your protege,
my protege?
Yeah.
That's not my protege. That's your protege.
No.
For sure.
Echo?
Oh, she was amazing, wasn't she? I mean,
How old was she?
I think she said she was 9, going to be 10 this fall. But was she and her mom showed up in the second half of the day, like really, really towards the end of the day.
Well, right in time
but
for
just
the hands-on.
in time for the last monument that you worked on. And
The pinnacle.
yeah. And she was so eager to be there that her mom had already brought along disposable gloves in her size. And I thought that was awesome.
So she jumped in and she was awesome. And then we also had 2 other boys, I believe Liam and Thomas.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
And they were on board also. And they were just incredibly happy, enthusiastic, and collaborated so well with each other. Usually, brothers are fighting with each other, but they were just wonderful kids. And to have those youngsters there, helping out, participating, it just, makes everything, all worthwhile,
Yeah, it was so fun to watch everything through the eyes of a kid. We get to experience these workshops over and over again and hear the same kind of storylines and the how-tos over and over. But to see something through the eyes of a child, the excitement, the eagerness, it was so refreshing and rejuvenating.
And good kids. I mean, it's
Amazing.
Nice to see kids not on their video games
Absolutely.
or a cell phone. These young people who attended the event were completely focused on helping cleaning stones and learning.
Yes.
That was refreshing.
Yes.
Absolutely. I'd say in 5, 10, 15 years, they could be the torch bearers,
Oh, they
Yeah.
will. They certainly will. They see the significance and they see how important it is at that age, and they'll definitely come back later in their lives and continue to help. Certainly.
right.
It was awesome, and also to have the adults that were involved then were everyone was loving it, so everyone backed off to help and encourage, and then it's much more educational and informational. And as Alicia was saying, to show that a 9 or a 12-year-old could do this, like this isn't rocket science. Like you just have to know what to do and when to do it. Be safety conscious, but like anyone can help out. And so it's not like it's something you need to have, incredible strength or knowledge or, years of training. It's like these kids were on board. And,
Right.
And so it was awesome to see.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. I genuinely believe that core memories were made for those kids yesterday, and you were a part of it. And that was really, really cool to witness and experience also.
Agreed. And so it's like a mental yo-yo here going back in time to almost the present. And so as we, reel the string back in and, from yesterday and now into today and all the images and impressions and events we see and so to bring it full circle back into Kennewick, Washington, where we are now, and heading to Boise, Idaho tomorrow for Saturday's event.
Interesting. Before you got here and we started rolling on the podcast, You mentioned you two did a little side trip today to a site where apparently in the past, they gathered elements, they mined elements that went towards nuclear bombs. Is that what I remember you were saying as I was rushing to get cameras ready? Is that?
Yeah, well, the bottom line is that I looked at the map and that there was, when I was plotting the course and also trying to find good lodging where there might be something to eat in the middle, I came up with Kennewick. But the only thing really en route was Yakima, Washington, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from here, north of here, toward Tacoma. And so I figured, well, on the route, we'll probably pull into Yakima and maybe there's a historic cemetery there. And sure enough, there was. And so I had planned that ahead of time and put it in my navigation. And I said, hey, we're going to go to this cemetery in Yakima and see what we find. And so it was a really cool cemetery. And there was a lot of old monuments there. And apparently it dated farther back than I expected, actually.
I think 1867?
Yeah, and then it said something about 1890, but I'm not sure that was when this town took it, took it over.
Maybe it was 1897. I'd have to go
No,
back.
there was earlier dates there that were fused into it. But anyway, the stone was in amazing condition because of the mostly arid environment, and not everyone probably realizes, but when you get away from the coast, everything changes quickly and it turns into desert pretty quickly on the West Coast. And then it's very arid. And stone, doesn't weather much at all under arid conditions. Think about like Egypt and, all the, historic artifacts that are found in these arid environments are preserved because there's no water, very low rainfall. And so we discovered some interesting things. Talk about the deterioration.
Oh, the deterioration on the marble there was so interesting because it was quite obviously spalling, especially on the upper portions of most of the marble in there. But even in the areas where it was incredibly deteriorated, there were still portions of pristine, polished carving. And it was something, a spalling that like I'd never seen anything like it before.
Right. And so usually you see an overall weathering that's fairly consistent.
Right. It's more uniform.
It might vary from the top to bottom a little, but generally all of the polish gets worn away by the, pollution, rainfall, acid rain, acid deposition. But here we're seeing something different. And we're seeing the top, the uppermost element, like the capstone portion or the flat area on the top, being like really rough and weathered and like degraded, like worn away like a quarter inch, a half inch, or even more. And then we're seeing the face of the stone on some of the stones still have a full polish.
Right. Or even one side of the stone is full polish and the other side is rough and deteriorated.
Incredible uneven weathering. And and there was definitely sprinklers, and we're trying to factor in hard water and sprinklers, and I'm coming up with theories that could account for this very unusual weathering pattern what we're witnessing. And to be clear, this is not on one stone, one gravestone monument. Like, we're seeing this pattern: one stone, another stone, and 10 stones, 20 stones, 50 stones. Like, you're seeing this repeat again and again and again. So it can't be reasoned out with, oh, there was this sprinkler close to the stone. It was a widespread phenomenon throughout the whole cemetery.
Right, but it was obvious that there was something more to it, because typically hard water staining also impacts the granite, and the granite was not impacted.
The granite was wildly clean, and it was like the granite monuments we're seeing from, like, say, 1890, 1910 were like, looked something out of a catalog. They were like brand new. There was
like the polish is like, I never felt it like that before.
No lichen, no growth. They were just like absolutely perfect. Like, they were like the day they were put up.
Right.
And so then yet we see this uneven weathering on the marble. Then also a lot of the bases and some of the tablets were sandstone. And we saw a few tree stumps out of sandstone, and that had a fair amount of weathering too.
Right.
But the marble was the most interesting.
Well, I don't think typically we're surprised by severe weathering to sandstone, because it tends to be pretty vulnerable in some instances. So to see some of that disintegrating or delaminating is not really that unusual. But to see marble in the condition this stuff was in was very unique.
Absolutely. And the other thing, excuse me, the other thing we saw there, which we've seen all over the Pacific Northwest, is virtually everything put into concrete.
Yes.
And that was having detrimental effects as well. And that's a regional thing, and it makes it very hard to reset the monuments. And unfortunate, but the main thing we really left with was the uneven weathering. And then we started to research the area. And what did you find?
Well, that's not exactly what happened. We started driving down the road, headed towards Kennewick, and we passed this like obvious, like secured area off the side of the road. And we're driving, and you're just, what is this? What is this? And pull it up on the maps. And it was the Hanford site, which was...
And I'm looking it up right now. The Hanford nuclear site was established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, and over the next 4 decades produced nearly 2/3 of the plutonium for the U.S.'s nuclear weapon supply, including the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And during its lifespan, hundreds of billions of gallons of liquid waste were dumped in underground storage tanks or simply straight into the ground.
Hundreds of billions of gallons.
Right.
So do you think this has something to do with the
well,
unique...
the estimates that I was reading while we were driving here said that the groundwater was contaminated for about 200 square miles. Was that what we read? So I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that if there was irrigation in the site, as we saw, plain evidence of that, the contaminated groundwater definitely had a contributory factor to the deterioration.
Well, the irrigation water generally is not drinking water,
right?
And it's generally not filtered water. And anyway, this is so close to that site,
right?
And they were, they're irrigating today still, and I don't know the history when they started, but to be clear, cemeteries in the arid areas all over America generally, in many situations, if they have the financial ability, use sprinklers to grow grass, because otherwise they look like a desert. And so this was not an exception to that rule. And we see this in many, many states, ranging from, Kansas, Nebraska,
New Mexico,
New Mexico, Oklahoma, Wyoming, all the way Nevada, California. And so, putting 2 and 2 together, so it was either the rainfall and or the sprinklers, but whatever that water was that was being delivered to these stones was dissolving them in an abnormal way, and the tops of them taking the brunt of it, because the water hits immediately, and it was basically melting, what it first hits, like remember those fizzy things you'd put in water?
Alka-Seltzer.
There you
plop,
go.
Plop, fizz, fizz.
So basically like that. And so it's just really epic. variation in the rate of weathering, like possibly like nowhere else in America. And we just happened to chance upon that en route on the 48 state tour. And that's one of the beauties of, I wish we had, a day or two in between each event, because then we could explore everything in the middle. But if we extended it to like 2 days per event, then it would be 112 days.
Yeah, you would never make it back to Connecticut to the
No.
office.
It would be snowing before it's.
Well, it's fascinating history, and the more I read through this, the more I wish I knew about this beforehand. And the Yakima Nation has been one of 4 local indigenous communities dedicated to the cleanup of the historic landscape. And it's been a tireless environmental and cultural challenge for them for advocacy and outreach to actually make something happen here and clean up the site. So it's been ongoing for decades.
I mean, how horrible for the government to come in and build these things. And of course, we can hope that no one knew the long-term consequences when this was all, evolving, but the end result is, so unfortunate. And, and we're observing this in the stones. That's what's so interesting. And we can see this all over the country, is that the stones tell the story of what the past was, and people, they can't read the stones. And so we can kind of read the stones and see what the past was to the region that may not be what the conditions are today. And in Pittsburgh, we can see what the steel industry did in the past. In Butte, Montana, we could see what the copper smelting did in the past. And so we saw that today in Yakima, Washington.
Well, fascinating. I'm glad you two stumbled upon that. And if we ever get back to this part of the world, I'd love to film it. Had a lot of history.
Yeah, we'll put on our hazmat suits. And,
Yeah, as soon as you realized what was over there, you were like, oh my God, we have to get out of here.
But I thought the mask prevents all that, no? Just a mask.
Yeah.
N95.
Well, and then he's like, oh, people are touring this site? Yes, they give
It's like
tours.
Chernobyl.
Yeah, you can just go visit it.
Well, it said in the thing she was reading, the history, that, well, now it's open to the public and you can visit. And then the next thing it said is how thousands of people were still working to clean it up. And I'm like, this doesn't seem to really add up here. Like, if it's open to visitation, people coming with their elderly, grandmother and children, like, maybe it's not the best site to visit.
No.
So, but anyway, all part of the 48 state tour, and the tour goes on,
It does go on. And so Saturday, July 6th, will be in Boise, Idaho at Old Idaho Penitentiary. How did you come across this particular location in Idaho?
Yeah. Well, we're bringing you to jail, Jeremy. So that's we were. So it was a saga, actually. And so Idaho itself, is, not the biggest state, not the most historic in the country, and doesn't have, the most involvement. And to be fair, our reach diminishes as we get to the West Coast, because we're based on the East Coast. And so, we just don't have a strong following in Idaho. So in other states like New York, we might have 20 or more requests to hold an event for the tour. And when we're out in Idaho, we just don't have that many good options. So ultimately, I took it upon myself to reach out and try to, make connections proactively, reaching out to nonprofits, state, historical societies, and different preservation groups, to put feelers out there and say, hey, do you guys know of a historic cemetery that would be interested, that, is in need of help and would benefit from a 48 state tour, workshop event? And ultimately, we connected with Iowa City, which is an amazing site, and it looked like a perfect fit. And we, locked that into our schedule, and we were counting on it. And then ultimately, when it got down the line, they wouldn't confirm it, and then backed off and said they had conflicts because of all of the logistics from the July 4th weekend. And so they didn't want to host the event. They said, we would have loved to do it, but the timing wasn't right. So basically, we were back to square one. And so then I was, working diligently to try to make connections. And lo and behold, then the Idaho Historic Society, who I had already messaged previous to any of this occurring, follows up with us, because, there was a long delay, and it made it through some chain of people, and someone said, wow, this sounds like a cool thing. And then we get a random email back that, yeah, we're interested in working with you. And they came up with the site. And so at that point in time, I was like, sounds great. We're excited, but I mean, I looked and did a little research online, and it was a really unusual event location, and I'm still not sure really what we're going to encounter there. It seems like it's kind of sparse on stones, but the history is, depending on what you read, is haunted, is, very kind of questionable. They said there's stones there with names that don't match anyone who was ever in the penitentiary. They said that, I read a lot of intrigue and mystery there in the little bit of research I did.
Yeah, built in 1870, the old Idaho Penitentiary is one of only 4 territorial prisons open to the public today. During its 101 years of operation, the site saw escapes, scandals, and the effects of Boise's transition from the Wild West to a mid-20th century capital city. It's going to be really interesting.
I'm so excited.
Yeah,
That's going to be so neat.
Perfect. It reminds me, in my backpacking days, when I was in Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden, there's a hostel there that used to be a former prison. And you can actually stay there for like $20 a night. Well, that was 20 years ago. And in a jail cell and with bunks.
Oh, wow.
So I have technically been to prison before.
Well, it'll be like going home then.
Yeah.
It'll be fun.
Yeah.
So the American Building Arts School, who we actually had a kind of collaboration with one step away with the stone carver in Charleston, Iris, who did a demonstration, but their previous location was in the Charleston jail. And the school, it was gifted to the American Building Arts College in some transition, and they literally ran the college out of the jail, out of the historic jail. Now they've moved on to new quarters, but I was there. It was quite interesting, and they literally had classrooms and everything in the jail itself, and that's in Charleston, South Carolina. So, but yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to it. And then July 8th, that's a Monday, we are in Eureka, Nevada at the Masonic Cemetery. And I know the two of you have been there before and you're looking forward to going back. Am I right?
I really liked traveling across Nevada on that loneliest road. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Some of the most pristine, gravestones from that time period are situated there because the weather is, just so arid. There's almost no rainfall. It's so rare that it doesn't have, deteriorating effect. And the stones are just phenomenal. And the white bronze, the marble, the granite, everything there is just amazing. And we're really happy to be returning there, and we never held an event in that town, but we were in the region a couple of years ago.
Right.
In Pioche.
Mm-hmm.
I always love driving through the deserts of Nevada. Maybe I'll see a UFO. So
Yeah.
I mean, we're hoping they're probably out there. We missed that in New Mexico, and we didn't have time to go to Roswell, but maybe next time around, and maybe we could do an event in Roswell.
Well, I've been looking for Bigfoot the last few events. I don't know about that.
it seems like every town in the U.S. has a Bigfoot group or the sightings, especially in Washington.
Yeah.
But all over. You go to
Yeah.
Louisiana, Georgia, there's a Bigfoot there too. New York, there's a Bigfoot.
Well, those forests full of like 200, 300 foot tall trees, one after the next. I'm just like, Bigfoot is probably in there. I mean, so, I don't know what's in there, but it's dense and there's a lot of it, and it just goes on and on.
Well, the Appalachians have different legends and, Mothman and
every
things like
continent,
that,
every
so-
culture, Sasquatch, Yeti,
Yeah.
it runs the
you
gamut,
never know
right?
what's out there. And I think that's what's interesting. Like, we know the U.S. is big, but until you actually are out there traveling it in a vehicle, seeing it like that, you cannot truly comprehend how vast and desolate some of these areas are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and quickly I'll go through. So July 10th, that's a Wednesday. We'll be in Schofield, Utah at Schofield Cemetery. And then July 12th, That's a Friday. That's Victor, Colorado at Sunnyside Cemetery. And July 13th, that's a Saturday, Colorado Springs Evergreen Cemetery, and that's still on the schedule, correct?
Yeah, it would seem that way, and yeah, it should be moving forward. And so we have an exciting week, a lot of distances. Schofield, the site of the biggest mining disaster to that date in American history, and just really epic and incredible history there. And 200 approximately miners died in that one morning, and I believe 149 of them were buried in the cemetery we're going to work in, so that's going to be an honor to be there. And I know some of them have wooden markers that were then replaced at a latter date, but some of them are stone, and there's a lot of need for help there, and they were really excited to have us come and work with them there. So that's going to be another really cool small town. We love going into the small towns because, it's so much more local interest and involvement, connecting with the descendants of the people there and making such a lasting and sizable impact on the community. And, the big sites, we can have some impact as well, but it doesn't seem to have as much kind of depth and, connection as it does in these small hometowns kind of. Well, thanks everyone for dialing in again and joining us. And, our tour, the 48 State Tour 2024, the adventure continues, and next we're off to Boise, Idaho, and then zigzagging our way back, heading east now, and we kind of overshot that. It's been an epic, trip out to the west, and now we're actually beginning heading east, but it's a long zigzag with a lot of miles, very indirect route to cover all the locations on the map on the tour, but we're really excited to cover all the remaining states, about half of them. And so, stay tuned, and, people come out to the events if you possibly can. Come out to one or two if they're near you, or, follow us on, your favorite social media platform, and just stay tuned, and more is yet to come.